Hey everyone, welcome back to the Legally Wired. I'm Shivani and with me is my friend Mitra. Well, I realize as I say this, when I say my friend Mitra, that roughly translates to my friend, my friend. But well, hey, some friendships are worth the double mention.
Always a pleasure to be the double friend, but more so for today's episode because we're going to be getting into the meaning of what exactly to do to stand out as an aspiring lawyer and build a pathway to some of the most coveted legal jobs in this country.
That's right. So, in our previous episode on how to build a digital presence at law school, we've really hammered home the point that a strong digital presence on platforms like LinkedIn, Substack, and Twitter is no longer just a nice to have. In fact, it's a key component of differentiating yourself as a aspiring lawyer. And we talked about how writing engaging article is the cornerstone of building this presence. For our listeners, if you haven't watched that episode, I highly recommend that you go ahead and watch it. We're linking the episode in the description for your reference. And for today's episode, we're not talking about why to write these articles and why to build a digital presence, but we are getting into the nitty gritty of how to do it. And this episode is all about the art and science of crafting legal articles online. All right, so Mitra, let's jump right into it. When we talk about building a digital presence and how writing is the way to do that, students often ask us what do they write about and how do they identify these topics while still at law school. What do you have to say to them?
It's a very puzzling question. You have taken the pathway to write articles, and the next question is how do I find a research topic, right? I think the natural instinct for a lot of people would be to again read textbooks or Google, you know, topics to write,
Yeah.
topics to write on, or research topics that I can write papers on, some kind of a Google search string. But the problem with both these methods is that you don't get at an interesting question which a lot of people would like to read,
And which
right?
is relevant for
Which is
today.
relevant for today. Um, the best way to do this, the best way to consistently generate ideas and to write about them in the field of law is to read newspapers. So think about it, right? What does law do? Law's purpose, very broadly, is to solve societal problems. What does the newspaper have? The newspaper talks about the problems of the day, okay,
Right.
and it's talking about inefficiencies of the government, inefficiencies in administration. It's essentially a playground of topics that you can research, curate, and write about, and most importantly, explore your interest in that field, right? So the best place to always start finding topics for research is just reading the newspaper. I'll add one more piece on this. The best gift that you can give yourself while you are at law school is a yearly subscription of the Mint newspaper.
I agree. And so you use the news as a starting point to identify your topic and build up your core issue. And then you go into these law books and, judgments and the actual law to build supporting arguments for the core issue that you have identified. So that brings us to the next question, right? How do students actually go about and identifying these great topics while observing the news cycle? And is there a way that they can use to recognize topics that would make for great articles?
So that's an amazing question to be answering, and I think the answer to this question is the core of our audio today. Um, the newspaper will contain all of society's problems, right? That's what the news does. It talks about the issues that are the reality today, and each of these issues can be analyzed from the lens of law, and from for each of these issues you can take a legal angle, and that can be a paper in itself. And if you write a paper in any of these areas, right, The expectation would be that you would go into the nitty gritties of research, and it would assist you in exploring whether you are actually interested in that field.
Right. So then what you're saying is that you look at a news article and you look at it from a legal lens and analyze, does this article, is it something that is regulated by law? That's the first question that you answer. And second, if there is a legal angle, if there is a current problem in the society or there's a current issue with this piece of law, which you can explore further. So do you have an example of from the current news cycle which you can think of where you can look at that article from the lens that we just discussed?
Today at random, I was reading a newspaper article on insurance policies, medical insurance policies specifically, and there was a case, there was a new rule by the IRDA that post 5 years from the date of procuring an insurance, even if a pre-existing medical condition shows up, then the insurance company has to still cough up the money for that illness unless there was fraud, unless the insurance company can prove that there was fraud in non-disclosure of the pre-existing condition.
Okay.
So this seems like a very ordinary article, and most people would move on to the next item. But if you look at this piece, right, like we live in a country like India where most people don't have access to first class healthcare. A lot of people are reliant on insurance companies for any of their medical needs. By using the concept of good faith and pre-existing disclosure of pre-existing condition, it is very broad, and you're putting an obligation on the policy holder to disclose every small issue that they've had. And what that does is that the insurance company will look at all this cumulatively and do one of two things. They will raise the premium, okay, to the point where you can't afford it, or they may refuse to provide you insurance. Right? So, and that is a problem in a country like India. You can't have a very broad standard of good faith disclosure of all pre-existing conditions. I think here the law would be doing it would be a social welfare measure if a law was passed on defining what pre-existing condition is, so that the disclosures are more narrower.
Yeah, so a law student that's looking at this article and they've identified this issue, there's so many avenues that you can take for legal research, right?
Yes.
When you see how have the courts addressed this issue. There should be a lot of cases where people have not disclosed something because they thought it's not important, and now the insurer is refusing to pay up the insurance amount.
So look at how the Supreme Court, I'm sure there must be even Supreme Court cases, on this piece.
Right.
And then you can see a trend. You can see that there's a judicial trend also which is trying to side with the policy holder, right? And that's the point. I think people, when they think about writing articles in law, they're thinking about a commentary on law itself, and that's not a very productive piece. A productive piece is how you use law as a tool to address larger policy issues in the country.
Yeah, and solve problems that are relevant today.
Yes.
Because most of the topics that if you go the other way around and you're picking a topic after reading a book, a law book, you are picking these grandiose ideas where you're critiquing the constitution for certain, which is not, it's done and dusted.
Critiquing the constitution makes sense so long as you can connect it to a real problem in society, right?
That's relevant today.
That is relevant today,
Correct.
right? So, for example, you want to critique the interpretation of the right to religion, but you are able to connect it on why religious institutions should be self-managed and the government should have no role. Then that you want to draw that link somewhere, then that makes sense, right? That you want to critique the constitution.
Yeah, but you're starting with the problem, and that might lead you to the constitution. You don't go to the constitution and find problems.
Yes.
That would be a futile exercise.
So writing a piece on the erroneous interpretation by another court, right? Like this court should have interpreted this judgment in this manner. What purpose does it serve? I don't know how many people find genuine interest in it, because the law is only fun when it comes alive.
Correct. And the objective why we're advocating people even write these articles is so that it catches the right eyeballs on LinkedIn or wherever you're writing. And it's an entryway for you to network with the right people.
Yeah.
And these are the kind of articles that will lead you, put you on that path. Okay, so now you've done this exercise. Is there a way that you can classify these core issues that students should be looking at? Are they broad archetypes that they can use as a framework to identify great topics?
Generally, I think that if you go through the pathway of looking at newspaper articles and analyzing them through the lens of law, you can broadly find three archetypes. The first one, I'll call it the gray zone, which is our insurance example, right? Places where the law is missing or hopelessly outdated. And you can ask, how does the ambiguity shape the industry? Have courts dropped any hints? How are people impacted? Look at the data of how people are impacted. For example, in our insurance case, you could write a piece on how, by not defining a pre-existing condition, the percentage of people who lose out on insurance.
And it can be in a very specific area, like for example, people with anxiety, they might not think of disclosing that on an insurance form because it's not really a serious issue that jumps to one's mind. And if there is history of people being denied insurance because they have not disclosed these kind of issues, these kind of ailments people have, then you can identify a very specific class of people who are getting impacted by this because some illness is very common today.
Absolutely. And a lot of people in India today don't have access to insurance because they're forced to disclose every pre-existing condition, and some of these pre-existing conditions may not have a long-term impact, or you may not. So but you're forced to disclose, right? You're forced to, then they draw some conclusions, and then they look at so many other factors, and they may decide not to insure you. So it is a very critical issue for you to look into.
So that was archetype 1, the gray zone.
Yeah, and the archetype 2, I would call that the clash zone. So in the clash zone, something where there are two different sides to the same argument. You pick a side and then you write a piece. For example, free speech versus platform liability, data privacy versus national security. And largely, if you read the newspaper article, the article will also try to cover both the sides briefly. And you can use that as an entry point to do a lot more research on the piece and actually write a value piece.
Yeah, so an example that I can think for the clash zone is something we brought up even in our previous episode, but the intermediary guidelines, which requires the government, which gives the government the right to ask social media platforms to bring down certain content because they deem it to be inappropriate or against national interests. Now, this is a clash zone, right? You have the government's right to look out for the national interest that is competing with a person's right to freedom of speech. And even the privacy angle in the same lens, like at what point does government have access to public records of yours?
And the final archetype is the impact piece. Impact piece, you look at new laws that have been passed, for example, the labor code, and you try to talk about the outcomes. But this is something that you have to be very careful with. The impact piece is not easy to write. Your outcomes must be predictable and acceptable by a good population who will read your article. So if you're starting this process, I think the best is to find newspaper articles that are in the gray zone where law is not fully there to cover a social issue, and then you do research and you see how courts have interpreted it, and you also talk about how it would be better off for society if there was a law to provide for these specific areas.
That's perfect. So once you start tagging the news this way, you'll realize that you're actually sitting on a gold mine of potential topics that you can write about, which would be way more relevant than anything that you find in a textbook. And for all our listeners that are looking for inspiration from other writers who do this really well, we have a couple of recommendations which we are going to link in the description. Do check it out. And yeah, with this, I guess it sums up the first leg of our discussion on how to identify topics that will make for interesting pieces. So now you have students, they've identified a killer topic to write on, and they know what are the angles that they need to explore. Now, the next question: how do they actually write good articles that are engaging, they're catching the right eyeballs? And especially when they are competing with people who are experienced in the industry. You have practicing lawyers also writing on the same topics. So how do they stand out from the crowd?
Firstly, I don't think you should look at it as a comparative game about you don't have to compete. If you want to write a true research paper on an aspect of society that interests you and you want to analyze it from a legal lens, I don't think you need to
think about what the others are doing.
Others are doing.
I agree.
Yeah. So, and if you're in law school and you're doing this, you have more time and you have access to better resources. You have access to a library. Somebody who's out there who has a full-time job and they're trying to write papers in their free time, they don't have a big library. They don't have expensive databases.
And these people who are writing from an industry practice perspective, they are drawing from their real life experiences.
Correct.
On what they're seeing with the issues that their clients are facing, or
Correct.
how they're seeing the courts behave on a
Correct.
particular matter. So that's anyway not a space that law school students can enter. So they need to make sure that they find avenues to add value to these pieces.
There is a different value in what experienced practitioners write, and there is a different value to be
A student writer.
When a student writes, right? So they all add value. It's just that the perspective is also different, and people who read are able to gauge the difference quite well. Now, for students, if they're writing papers for the first time, I think stick to the IRAC format. IRAC is something that you learn on day one of law school, right? You identify a list of issues that you have researched and you want to address in your article, and then the rule part can be blended in with the analysis. You don't have to stay, it's not a memo, it's a research paper. The IRAC is generally followed as a structure for writing memos rather than research papers. But if you want a pathway to format or structure your paper, then you can think about it as issues and analysis and conclusion. And the analysis will include the legal analysis also.
Yeah.
And generally, as a writing style, I think with the kind of tech that we have today, you don't have to worry if your English is not so great. Generally, the trick is to stick to short sentences while you're explaining your content. And wherever you feel that you have a difficulty in explaining an idea and you feel that the public won't get it, use GPT.
Yeah, free flow write it and ask GPT to paraphrase it.
Not paraphrase it, to fix the English. Directly ask GPT to fix the English and make it in a more readable or engaging form. Don't worry about using GPT. As long as you are the one who's inputting the content into GPT and you're asking GPT to fix English, that's fine. That's why we have these tools today. And what matters is the idea, not the language or the medium in which to write it in. And GPT is a great equalizer that way. You don't need to know fancy English to write a great paper. You need to have a great idea to write a great paper.
And for students who want inspiration for the simple style of writing that we are advocating here, you are welcome to check out the Legally Wired newsletter. It is not written for students, it's written for actually business folks who want to understand the law better. So it's intentionally kept very simple so that even a layman can understand it. And we're going to include a link to that in the description below.
And I just want to add one more piece before concluding this audio. When you are starting to write articles, in the manner that we described. Don't focus on perfection.
Right.
Focus on getting your articles out. The first few pieces will not be the best pieces. You take feedback, you work on that feedback, and you write better content in time.
Yeah, the writing style is something that just develops over time, so you don't need to wait till you become an amazing writer. But for those students who really want to polish their writing skills and become a naturally better writer without the use of these AI tools, there are a bunch of writing programs out there. It doesn't have to be something that's designed for lawyers. Just any clear writing program will take you a long way in getting you to practice this skill. So, with this, for all the aspiring lawyers, we have set out for you a pathway on building a digital presence in the previous episode. And with this episode, we are actually talking about how to write great articles to build your digital presence. All you need to make sure is that you follow these steps, identify core issues from the news, and work backwards and find supporting arguments to make a great research article. And what is the points that you need to keep in mind in terms of your writing style? You need to be clear, concise, and very brief for writing on LinkedIn. And that's all for today's episode on Legally Wired.
Thanks for tuning in. If this episode helped you or sparked an idea, share it with a friend, leave a comment, or better yet, send us your next article draft. We'd love to see what you're working on and possibly give you some feedback. Until next time, stay wired.